Don't go home.
Stay back!
Please listen to me.
Stay away from me!
If you go home, you will die. I saw it.
Stay the fuck away from me!
Listen, please. Please, I'm a kumiho.
Finally, we find out what happens to Atticus and his time in South Korea and with his Asian bait. And what an episode, guys. Shit. Hey guys, before we start this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and definitely check out my podcast, the Magical Negro Podcast. That link is in the description box below. Check it out. We really get deep into this episode and all other episodes of Lovecraft Country. Hey guys, Shalana here. Welcome to the Bingezone. On today's video, we're talking about episode 6 of Lovecraft Country, Meet Me in Daegu. And in this episode, we find out more about Atticus' time in South Korea. And I like the fact that this episode expands the world of magic. So far, we've been stuck in America, following American magic, white magic, if you will. Even though episode 3 does have voodoo and we're using Western African mythologies, I'm glad to see that the entire world of Lovecraft is a world of mysticism, and every culture has their own traditions, has their own magic, and that representation matters. Like, a kumiho is part of Korean lore and magic, and I'm glad that they're incorporating that. It's not just Lovecraftian creatures like Cthulhu, but a kumiho being a part of this episode really expands the scope of Lovecraft Country. This episode starts off in 1949, 6 years prior to what we're seeing in the first 5 episodes, and this episode, we're introduced to our main character, Ji-ah, and she's at a movie theater watching Judy Garland on screen. And when the people who are in the theater leave, she imagines herself getting up, dancing, singing along. And movies and arts have always been a way for us to escape our reality, escape what's going on around us. Even if you guys or me watching Lovecraft Country for an hour a week is an escape to all the things that's going on around the world and around us, we get to lose ourselves in this show for an hour, lose ourselves in a book, lose ourselves in art. Art is all-encompassing. Literature, paintings, photography, movies, television, all those things are a form of art, and all those things are necessary for humans to have some relief to our day-to-day. And I find it very interesting that our main character, who's not completely human, uses that as escape, which kind of humanizes her character, even though she is not human. But we're here in 1949, and the episode starts off, and the Korean War is just starting off, because we know this takes place in the 50s, and Atticus served in the Korean War. So that fact being that it starts off with the Korean War introduces us to the landscape and the backdrop of what's happening. Next, we find ourselves in Ji-ah's home, and Ji-ah's mother is telling her that she needs to find a man to bring honor back to their family. This is a very deceptive scene because initially we see her as a mother who lost her husband and she needs the daughter to bring a man home to bring honor to the family. So off rip, we're thinking, okay, this mother's a little overbearing. She needs her daughter to go out, even though her daughter's trying to be a strong, independent woman, telling her mom that once I graduate school and I become a nurse, I'm gonna restore the honor to our family. And the mom's like, no, we need a man here. And at first, this is a typical mother-daughter dynamic, and we're following along, and we see Ji-ah going on dates. But because of her quirky nature and the things that she likes, she doesn't seem to be finding anybody. She goes speed dating, and none of the guys want her because she doesn't come off as the traditional type of woman they'd like. She's more interested in the art. She's more quirky, if you will. She's a unique individual, and especially in Eastern cultures, they like a certain type of women, if you will. And even in Western cultures, I'm not going to limit this to Eastern cultures, but even in Western cultures, the fact that she is more outgoing and more quirky, not the traditional sense of a woman, they're not interested in her. But later that night, she ends up in a bar and she meets a guy who she takes home. And once she gets home with that guy and she goes straight to the bedroom, I'm thinking like, this isn't usually how the courting system works. But then we see her transform and all these tales come out of her and starts absorbing the man, and she sees his past, his present, and his future, and she kills him. And the mother walks in as the mother was already aware of what's happening, and the mother tells her she has 10 souls to consume for her to get back to normal, to being her regular human. And that's where we're introduced to the legend of the kumiho. Now, the kumiho is the nine-tailed fox. Think of Naruto, the nine-tailed fox, Kurama in Japanese mythology. Kumiho is the Korean counterpart, and both of those actually stem from Chinese mythology. The nine-tailed fox comes from the Chinese mythology, and Japan has their version of the nine-tailed fox in Kurama, and Korea has their version, the kumiho. The legend of the kumiho goes like this. It's a fox who's lived up to 1,000 years. Once that fox gets to be 1,000 years old, it can transform and become human. And In its human form, it's usually a woman, and it's used to seduce men. And using the seduction of the woman appeal, the sexy woman appeal, it takes the man in and they consume the man and eat his liver, his soul, whatever the case, and it sustains itself through man eating, if you will. It's very interesting that the show actually takes this route, because using a kumiho as the man eater, her whole purpose is to consume the souls of men. But throughout the episode, we see that she doesn't want to go down that route, because she has to consume 100 souls in order for her to become human. And she's being egged on by her mother. Her mother's pushing her, yo, eat, bring more men, become human, become human. And Lovecraft does this curious thing where it's always portraying the monster, in this case who's Ji-Ah or the kumiho, and humans. And a lot of times the humans come off more monstrous than the actual monster, because she is the one who gets sustained by eating souls, but she doesn't want that. She wants to live a normal life without consuming souls, while it's her mother pushing her. While it's the whole notion of the Korean War and their fight against communism, killing innocent people in the name of democracy and liberty, listening to American propaganda and propaganda against communism. And all of those things, this whole episode shows us that it's similar to episode 1. It shows us that just like episode 1, when we're dealing with monsters, the humans are more monsters. This is a theme of Lovecraft Country. Every episode, if you look at it, it's the humans always doing the more monstrous acts as opposed to the creatures at the time. The Shaggoths, or the ghost in the Winthrop house, or even Yahima. And even when it comes to this episode, the kumiho, instead of the nine-tailed kumiho, the evil malevolent spirit being the most monstrous, it's the humans and their actions to each other that comes off as the most monstrous part. As the episode continues, we find out the kumiho's best friend is a communist sympathizer, and we see what happens to communists in Korea and how the Americans just let them kill communists in order to gain traction in the Korean War. And her friend gets found out and dragged to an execution style in which Atticus, who is our main character, kills an innocent woman in cold blood. Now, we know throughout the first few episodes, Atticus said the war did something to him. The war changed him. It turned him into a cold-blooded killer. This is a nerdy kid who grew up in Chicago, who grew up reading books, and he had to do these horrific acts, and war changes everybody. But killing somebody in cold blood, like, I have to see how Atticus moves forward. For me, as a character, I enjoyed Atticus's character. I liked when I thought he was so chivalrous and so nice, but at the end of the day, like, he killed somebody. He came out of nowhere, pulled out his gun and shot somebody in cold blood. Now, I understand he was just following orders, but at what point do you stop following orders and that begins to weigh on you? Because we can't give you a pass for following orders. Just like when the Nazis were killing people, we didn't give them a pass for following orders. So at what point is the order stopping, and this is who Atticus is, and this is who he's become? And we saw throughout the first 5 episodes how violent and bullheaded Atticus is. So at what point does he stand up for himself, or he's gonna just use the whole thing of following orders as a scapegoat? Because we saw how he beat the shit out of Montrose last episode. So we see that evil darkness in him, and we see him being gravitated towards magic and wanting to use magic and take magic for himself. So it's like, at what point does Atticus realize and hold responsibility for himself? Because at the end of the day, he did those things. They're weighing on his conscience, but he did them. And that lives within him. That evil, that anger, that hurt is inside of him. That lust for power and wanting magic is inside of him. Shortly after that happens, Tick ends up in the hospital and she sees him. She hates him, especially after her movie theater was closed, because the movies were closed as a way to stop communist propaganda. So even though Americans were propaganding everybody, they're trying to stop other people from using movies and film as a way to spread their propaganda, which is a tactic that has been used throughout history of film and TV. Whether it's Americans, whether it's communists, everybody uses the visual medium as a way to form and send out propaganda. So they're using that, they're stopping her. So now she has no escape. All she has is her hatred for Atticus, and she wants to kill him. But as she gets to know him, we find out that Atticus actually took the book, The Count of Monte Cristo, with him, his father's favorite book, and he's reading it. Even though him and Montrose don't have that relationship, we see that Tick throughout the season, he longs for that relationship with his dad. Like, even though his dad was abusive, his dad's a piece of shit to him, Tick is just a boy who wants the love of his dad. So maybe by reading his dad's favorite book, he'll get an understanding of who his dad is, what happens. But as this is happening, Tick and Gia grows closer and closer together, and she goes from wanting to kill him to falling in love, because Tick has game. Like, Tick does what he needs to do to get the girl. He's real nice. Tick, even though I went off on him earlier about how he needs to face the reality of what he did. Tick is still a nice guy, even though he has a deep darkness inside of him. So he invites her back to the barracks. He recreates the movies for her. They get close and they begin to get close and make love to each other. And when that starts to happen, we find out that Tick is a virgin. So we get an inverse of what happened with him and Letty. With him and Letty, she was a virgin and he took her virginity. In this episode, he is a virgin and G.I. is going to take his virginity, and he's afraid at first, but he wants to take it slowly. He wants to feel the connection, even though she's more experienced from years of absorbing souls of other men. And I want to talk about her and absorbing souls of other men and the trauma associated with her, her father, and just what happens, because the monstrous nature of these characters are reflected by their surroundings. Her father used to abuse her and her father used to rape her, and her mother allowed it because she wanted a man. Because we see that it's all about appearances for her mother. She wanted a man, so she let the father do as he will with their daughter. And one day she has enough of her husband abusing her daughter, so she summons the soul of the kumiho into her body. And in that body, the kumiho kills the father, absorbs his soul, and see that even though he was weird, twisted, his version of love was weird and twisted. He did love his wife. He did love his daughter, even though it's a weird way of expressing love. And this episode shows us that love is weird. Love is confusing. And to explain the notion of love is to peer deep and see just what people will and won't do for the ones they love. And conjuring spirits of a kumiho, taking advantage of your daughter, having your father abuse you, all those are expressions of love, even though they're toxic and they're not the right expression. People truly believe what they're doing is because they love you. They do these fucked up things to you and they kind of abuse their power and abuse situations because of how they feel. They love you how they want to love you as opposed to how you need to be loved. And the theme throughout this episode is accepting people for who they are and loving them the way that they are and how they like to be loved. While she's a kumiho, her mother wants to exorcise the spirit of the kumiho out of her and actually make her human again and make her forget who she is, strip her of her identity for a perceived notion of who her daughter is. No matter what Tick did, Montrose beat the living shit out of him because he loved his son and he wants his son to be the way he is. You love someone and you want the person to be your way. If you truly love them though, because these are bastardizations of love. If you truly love somebody, you accept them for who they are, you take them in as they are, and you love them for who they are and what they are. And that's what Tick and Gia start to learn about each other. And instead of looking at their past deeds, they look at each other and try to love themselves for who they are. So when kumiho releases her tails into Tick and she sees his past, his present, his future, she sees that Tick is going to die if he goes back to America because she can see the future and she sees that eventually he's going to die. She sees Letty, Tick's baptism. So all these are things we can look forward to in the future episodes. And it's like, okay, my man's about to die. She can't let her man die. So she's like, yo, Tick, don't go back. But Tick is so freaked out that she's a creature, a monster. And now that we see Tick's reaction to her, it starts to make sense as to why he's not totally crazy and afraid of monsters as everybody else around him, because he's been introduced to monsters before. When he was in Korea, he saw the worst in humanity, which is why he is the way he is. He stands up for people when he sees racism and white people going buck ham in the first few episodes. And when he's seeing the Shoggoths and he's seeing other creatures, he's not totally freaked out because he saw this before. That is the basis of this episode. It's accepting people for who they are, looking at the transgressions that they've done. This episode are pretty interesting and pretty self-contained. Is arguably to me the weakest episode thus far because it's so totally removed from the previous episodes. It gives the backstory that we wanted, but at the same time it's like, okay, we have Christina's storyline, Montrose's storyline, all these other storylines going on, and we spend the majority of this episode on the backstory of the kumiho as opposed to Tick's dynamic with it and him being introduced, because this episode is about an hour long. The first 35 minutes don't even feature any of our main characters. It's just a backstory of the kumiho and telling her story and how that interacts with the later parts of Tick, even though Tick doesn't even get exposed to that world of magic to the very end. But that's my thoughts on this episode, guys. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button. Until next time, binge on.